Hello and welcome to the Apalachicola Chattahoochee Flint River Basin Drought and Water webinar for the month of October. I'm Rachel McGuire with the Auburn University Water Resources Center located in Auburn, Alabama. If you're new to the webinar, we'll have time for comments, questions, and discussion at the end following our final speaker. Throughout the webinar, feel free to use the question box on the GoToWebinar tool panel to type in a question, or you can raise your hand throughout the webinar or at the end and you will be called on when we have Q&A at the end of our time. Our speakers today will be David Zierden, the Florida State Climatologist with the Florida Climate Center on our current drought status, as well as our seasonal forecasts and outlooks. We also have Tom Littlepage, Branch Chief of the Alabama Office of Water Resources with the State of Alabama Input. Paul Inkhorn, a hydrologist with the USGS South Atlantic Water Science Center, will speak to our stream flows and groundwater conditions. Todd Hamill with the NOAA National Weather Service's Southeast River Forecast Center will have our streamflow forecasts. Jody Juan of the Army Corps of Engineers Mobile District will update us on our ACF reservoir conditions, and Samantha Lucas of the Apalachicola National Estuarine Research Reserve will give us Apalachicola Bay salinity information. Speakers, remember to unmute yourself prior to speaking and let me know when you are ready for your next slide. And with that, I'll start with our first speaker, David Zierden. When you're ready, David.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Rachel. And we're going to begin today's webinar with a topic that I don't think we've ever really covered before, and that's a current red tide outbreak, both in the Apalachicola River estuary and Apalachicola Bay, and all along the western Florida panhandle. I've seen this firsthand with the past several weeks of dead fish being washed up on the beach at St. George Island. I think the bay is in a little better shape. Hopefully Samantha could speak more on current conditions there. But a little background, red tide or Karenia brevis is a naturally occurring microscopic algae, and it's always present in background levels in the coastal waters. But when conditions are right, blooms can occur with much higher concentrations that can actually give the water a red coloring. And this microscopic algae releases a toxin that can both kill all varieties of wildlife and marine life, but it can also irritate the nose, throat, and lungs of humans and animals on the shore. Over on the left is kind of the current conditions as monitored by Florida FWC, where actual samples in the yellow and red dots showing concentrations, and also satellite imagery showing the color of the water, kind of a surrogate for where this red tide might be more concentrated. And right now off the coast of Panama City and the western panhandle seems to be where the higher concentrations are, but like I say, it has been affecting the estuary of Apalachicola Bay and St. George Sound. There's not really a climate or drought connection. There is some evidence that excess nutrients and nutrient runoff can make these blooms worse or more frequent, and also warmer Gulf temperatures could help worsen the severity or frequency of these outbreaks, but that's a lot of conjecture, not a lot of hard science to back that up right yet. Just the science isn't fully developed. As an anecdote, along Southwest Florida, they're now seeing outbreaks nearly every year, so it does appear to be becoming more frequent. So with that, we'll leave this alone and go to our next topic on the next slide, and that's our active Atlantic hurricane season, or it was up until this point. The last month has been very, very quiet in the tropics, with only one tropical storm to speak of, Tropical Storm Victor, that's spun harmlessly off the coast of Africa. But prior to that, at the time of our last webinar, we'd been in the midst of a very active season, as I show on the upper left-hand image, and we'd actually experienced 6 tropical systems making landfall along the northern Gulf Coast up until that point of our last webinar. So it's been a very welcome reprieve from the hurricane and tropical storm activity in the Atlantic Basin. Over on the right is the current 5-day outlook, with just a small chance for a kind of hybrid storm to develop off the northeast coast and spin harmlessly out to sea. So that's very welcome news. Looking at some of the longer range forecasts from private meteorologists, it looks like November might even continue to be less active. So certainly good news. And here, looking at hurricane season climatology, here we are around the end of October. We're well past the peak of the Atlantic hurricane season. There is still the possibility of storms developing and impacting the U.S. through the month of November and even into December, but the chances are becoming less and less. And with an active jet stream pattern and the jet stream starting to migrate further south, conditions are becoming less and less favorable for development. And if we look at the bottom right, this just shows the historical points of origin for tropical systems this first third of November. And we now see that main development region off the coast of Africa has quieted down. Many of the Atlantic storms tend to recurve and not make landfall. The Western Caribbean is still a point of focus, and these are the storms that could make it into the Gulf and still potentially impact us before this hurricane season is over. So on the next slide, we'll go ahead to the next slide and start talking about our most recent climate over the past month or so. And we had a dry October? Well, looking at this graphic on the right, this shows for the month of October across the United States where it ranks as the driest month of the year. And you see colored in red, much of the Southeast, including nearly all of the ACF Basin, October is climatologically the driest month of the year. And in some places we've lived up to that. Over on the left hand just shows month to date or rainfall totals over the last month or so across the Southeast United States. We see North Florida has been very dry, amounts of just a fraction of an inch to a little over 1 to 2 inches, a little more across South Alabama, South Georgia. Pensacola is an outlier at 12.8 inches. And also we see heavier amounts across the middle ACF Basin, from Montgomery through Atlanta, amounts of 5 to 7 inches in the month of October, which is above normal. But other parts of the basin have been closer to normal and typically dry as this time of year is. So on the next slide, we'll start looking at the drought situation. And this is the current US drought monitor, showing that the Southeast is largely drought free. A few pockets of D0 or abnormally dry showing up along the Georgia coast and also coastal Carolinas. These are spots we're watching, but right now it's just abnormally dry. Does not mean that drought is set in yet. For the entirety of the ACF Basin, though, everything is currently drought free. And on the next slide, we'll take a look at the Lawn and Garden Moisture Index from University of Alabama, Huntsville, which is a good indicator of short-term dryness. And here we do see the drying trend across the Southeast, where most of the ACF Basin is now considered fairly dry on this scale. And certainly the coastal Carolinas, where that D0 is starting to set in, also stick out on the Lawn and Garden Moisture Index. So on the next slide, we'll start looking at recent rainfall. And this is again, the National Weather Service radar estimates. And this is over the last 7 days or 1 week. And we see fairly dry conditions over the last week. Over most of Georgia, it's either light blue or white. corresponding to weekly totals of just fractions of an inch. A little more rainfall over central Alabama, the Montgomery and Birmingham areas of half an inch to up to 2 inches in spots, but no widespread heavy rainfall over the last week. On the next slide, we'll look a little further back at rainfall over the last 30 days, and kind of a similar story. North Florida certainly has been drying, 30-day totals of less than 2 inches across a lot of North Florida, heavier amounts across the Florida Panhandle, especially the coastal areas of the Western Panhandle. But we also see heavier amounts, as I showed on the station data, across the middle ACF basin, basically from Montgomery through Atlanta, of 5 to 6, 7 inches or more across portions of the middle and upper ACF basins. So kind of a mixed bag over the last month across the ACF. On the next slide, we'll now look at rainfall departures from normal instead of totals. And this continues the trend we've seen most of the summer. Nearly all of Alabama and the Florida Panhandle much above normal rainfall over the last 90 days. That continues across most of western Georgia and all of the ACF basin. We also see the dryness that's starting to set in coastal South Carolina and North Carolina. So with that, we'll go to the next slide and start looking ahead. And this is the 7-day quantitative precipitation forecast. And over on the left hand, I have the surface forecast map for 48 hours or 2 days from now. And it shows an active pattern with a fairly vigorous low pressure system tracking across the southern United States and midsection of the United States, and also a developing nor'easter off the coast of New England that will bring them heavy rainfall. But as these systems progress, they're not going to bring abundant rainfall to the southeast or the ACF basin, as we see forecast amounts only in the 1 to 1.5 inch range over the next 7 days. So on the next slide, we'll start looking further ahead. And here's where we have some kind of bigger news on the El Nino La Nina cycle. Here I show current sea surface temperature departure from normal. And we see a large swath of below normal sea surface temperatures all across the Pacific Ocean along the equator, starting to really get that configuration of a mature and well-developed La Nina phase. And in fact, NOAA's Climate Prediction Center 2 weeks ago did declare that we are in La Nina conditions, and they are issuing now La Nina advisories. On the bottom, you see their familiar Nino 3.4 index, which in the last couple weeks has dropped below that -0.5 degree threshold, which delineates La Nina, and now we're approaching actually -1 degree Celsius. So this La Nina continues to strengthen. And on the next slide, before we go to the forecast, let me just point out, go to the next slide. All of the markings on this graphic didn't show up, but I want to point out that this is going to be our 2nd year in a row of La Nina conditions, which is really the rule and not the exception when it comes to the La Nina phase. As we look back in 2010 through 2012, 1998 through 2001, most of the time when we get this La Nina phase, it lasts for 2 or more years. So a multi-year La Nina is actually the rule and not the exception. So with all that in mind, we'll take a look at the forecast for the Pacific Ocean. Here, the latest forecast shows high chances, over 90% of La Nina conditions continuing through November, December, January, 87% chance through the climatological winter, and then chances start falling as we get into the spring season, which is the typical life cycle of a La Nina. So very strong forecast for continued La Nina conditions through the winter and into spring of next year. And just over on the right are the model projections, which are becoming a little more robust and centering around cold water in the Pacific Ocean. Almost all the models showed La Nina conditions through the fall and into the winter. And on the next slide, we'll just review what that means. This is our kind of conceptual model of how cold water in the Pacific affects our jet streams. It leads to this pattern of troughing over the eastern United States, ridging over the western U.S., but a storm track that leaves the southern tier from the desert southwest all across the northern Gulf Coast, typically warmer and drier than normal. So this is the typical pattern we see when we have La Nina conditions, with the caveat that this does not occur every year that we have La Nina conditions. As we saw last year, which I have on the bottom two graphics, these are the actual precipitation and precipitation on the left, temperature on the right. These are the actual precipitation and temperature patterns from November through January of last year, and they are very much unlike the typical La Nina, where we've actually had enhanced rainfall across portions of the southeast, drier than normal conditions across Northern California. And on the right, if we look at temperature, we had much elevated temperatures over the Dakotas and the upper Great Plains, where typically that area is colder than normal. So we didn't have the typical La Nina patterns last year, but that doesn't mean that that's still not, the odds aren't tipped in that favor, and it's still not a good forecast for this coming year. And with that in mind, we'll look at the CPC official 3-month outlook on the next slide. And the CPC, Climate Prediction Center, is going all in on La Nina this year. Both the temperature outlook on the left with the strong forecast for above normal temperatures across the southern United States, and the rainfall forecast on the right with a fairly strong forecast for increased chances of below normal rainfall across the southern tier of the United States, especially the state of Florida, southern Alabama, most of Georgia. So they're kind of going all in on La Nina again and really following this typical La Nina pattern to guide them in their forecast for the next 3 months. And on the next slide, we'll go ahead and finish up with the seasonal drought outlook. And this continues the theme that they're going all in on La Nina, where now they're showing most of the peninsula of Florida as drought development likely, where currently there is no drought. So they're fairly confident that La Nina will bring drier than normal conditions. And also these areas of coastal Carolina and Georgia that are currently in abnormally dry conditions, drought is forecast to develop there also. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Red tide is currently affecting the estuary of Apalachicola River and the Florida Panhandle. Over the last month, thankfully, the tropics have been very quiet. We're cautiously optimistic this will continue through the remainder of the tropical season, although development in the Western Caribbean is still something we have to watch out for. The Southeast US is nearly entirely drought-free, with only some small pockets of D0 along the coastal Carolinas and Georgia coast. We've had more or less a typical dry October for much of the area. However, it was wetter than normal in the middle ACF basin. Currently, we're in an active jet stream or storm pattern for the next week, but no really heavy rainfall amounts forecast for the ACF basin. The La Nina advisory was declared by NOAA with an 85 to 95% chance it will last through the winter months. And the CPC seasonal forecast heavily favors above normal temperatures and below normal rainfall following that typical La Nina reaction. And drought development forecast as likely over peninsular Florida, and also the greater southeast with La Nina conditions will be an area of interest.
Thank you for that update, David. Now I'll turn it over to Tom Littlepage with the State of Alabama input.
And I'll try to keep it short. Go ahead with the first slide, Rachel. So basically, as what we saw with David, we continue to have a pattern of no or clear drought conditions in Alabama. And so next slide. As a result of that, we have not modified our drought declarations since May, based on both current conditions and then what we heard from David is continuing forecasts of plenty of rain and rainfall. Okay, next slide. We are continuing, though, to do our monitoring and due diligence and watching conditions, and that information is available on our website. So if you have a need for updated flow or information that we put together for the state, please feel free to partake of the resources on our website. Next slide. So this is going to be the same story that we've been saying throughout these last several months. We are certainly, David has reinforced the need to continue to watch this building of La Nina. As you saw there on David's chart, that La Nina has a drying implication for the southern third to two-thirds of the state. So we're going to be watching that very carefully, especially as we get into the early spring and the condition of our reservoirs going into next summer's cycle. Last slide. As a result of the conditions, we had a MIG meeting in early October where we reviewed conditions, and we've decided to not schedule another meeting yet. It'll probably be the first of the year before we pull together another group, but depending on what we see and the conditions that we're monitoring, we may call one sooner. But at this point, there are no meetings of the monitoring impact group scheduled at the current time. Thank you. Be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Tom. Now I'll turn it over to Paul Inkhorn with our stream flows and groundwater conditions.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So we'll start with our traditional view of the real-time network across the southeast. So the image on the right are showing current conditions, and then those instantaneous values are color-coded and ranked against historical means. So the more red or orange are dry conditions, green showing normal conditions, and then moving through blue to black for higher flows. So again, looking at the image on the right, you see the southeast, a majority of stations are either showing above normal or normal conditions, with some exception in that drier area in western or eastern, north and South Carolina that David was showing and alluding to dry conditions. The streams there are flowing at below normal conditions currently. The southeast or the ACF basin, the headwaters are showing above normal conditions, and then moving down through the basin, some stations are showing lower flow, but that's a result of regulation. And then the Flint River is actually ranking right now above normal for a majority of those sites moving downstream. All right, we'll look at the next slide. So this is the below normal 7-day average stream flow, which is an indication of hydrologic drought, and little change from our last webinar. The ACF is currently hydrologically drought-free. There's a small lingering basin on the Florida Panhandle there that has pretty much shown up during every webinar we've shown, and it right there is showing some abnormally dry conditions. So that's just a lingering basin there that just doesn't seem to return to normal. But anyway, we'll move on and we'll start looking at long-term trends. So the black line shows the 28-day average stream flow, and then that is ranked against historic daily means for the period of record for each station. So we see here, this is Lake Lanier inflow, Chattahoochee River at Cornelia and Dahlonega. And both stations, the 28-day average flow is right at the 95th percentile. So that's showing much above normal flow entering Lanier. We'll move to the next slide. These are stream flows below Lanier, and Chattahoochee at Atlanta is currently also showing 28-day average flow to be around the 95th percentile, so that's much above normal. And then further downstream at Whitesburg, we're seeing flows approaching above normal conditions at the 90th percentile. So as a whole, higher flows throughout the basin. Next slide. Moving further down through the Chattahoochee, West Point is showing flow to be at the above normal condition, and then Columbus is showing flow at the just below the 90th percentile at much above normal. Next slide, we'll look at the Flint River. So starting upstream at Griffin, flow there is ranking above normal, and Carsonville is much above normal. The next slide, the Flint River at Albany and Bainbridge. Albany is ranking at above normal, and Bainbridge, as you can see, right around the 95th percentile. The next slide, this is the Apalachicola River at Chattahoochee, and flow there is also at the 95th percentile, so ample flow through the basin. All right, we'll turn now to the next slide. This is groundwater conditions. So as you see, current conditions is showing on the right, and little change from our last brief. So throughout the basin, majority of stations are showing above normal groundwater conditions. And then our circled indicator stations there will show on the next slide. So Miller County, the groundwater elevation there is fluctuated minor through the past 30 odd days. And the mean daily is ranking at the much above normal percentile there. And next station will show Doherty County. So again, little fluctuation through a majority of the time span since our last webinar, with a slight drawdown there of a few feet, but that's typically what we see at that well. And as a whole, the conditions there are showing to be above normal. So, excuse me, next slide, we'll just bring up the summary. So the real-time stream flow at the ACF Basin, currently ranking from much above normal to the low range. The below normal 7-day average stream flow indicates that the ACF Basin is hydrologically drought-free. 28-day average stream flow for the Chattahoochee River currently ranked from much above normal to above normal. And the 28-day average stream flow for the Flint River is showing the same, much above normal to above normal. And then real-time groundwater conditions at the monitoring wells are currently ranked at much above normal and above normal, respectively. All right, thank you. That wraps it up.
Thanks, Paul. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jody Juan with our ACF reservoir conditions.
Hi, Rachel, thank you. If you could go to the next slide to start it off. So this is at the top of the ACF Basin with Lake Lanier, or also Beaufort Dam. Currently, it is slightly above top of conservation, and we are currently drawing down for our winter pool elevation. That began in October 1st, and will be ending in December 1st. You can go to the next slide, please. West Point is a little bit different. It's slightly below top of conservation, but that's because we've been trying to support drawdown measures at Woodruff at the very bottom of the ACF Basin. We are still on track, however, to schedule our drawdown November 1st, and that will go up to December 15th is when we'll hit our winter pool elevation, if everything goes to schedule. We are currently waiting to see what tomorrow will bring. There's a couple of thunderstorms right before this November 1st start time, to see where we will be once we start that drawdown. Go to the next. Perfect. Walter F. George. Walter F. George, we're in a pretty good place right now to be at at November 1st. We're slowly hitting that midway point. Walter F. George began its drawdown on October 1st and will end the winter pool drawdown at 188 for elevation on December 1st, similar to Lake Lanier. For Jim Woodruff, we're currently ramping down towards 10,000 CFS, and we're making pretty good pace on it currently, and we're probably going to stay there for a little bit. And there's currently no drought operations or anything like that at Jim Woodruff. Go to the next slide, please. Overall, the ACF Basin is in either in composite zone 1 or even above it in terms of the composite conservation storage and the flood storage. And if you go to that last slide in terms of the summary. Again, Lake Lanier is above guide curve, and we are slowly transitioning the pool elevation to its winter pool elevation. Lake Lanier and Walter F. George will transition, and that winter pool transition will end on December 1st. West Point's winter pool transition is scheduled for November 1st if basin conditions are stable and don't fluctuate until then, and that will end on December 15th. All projects are within Zone 1, and we are currently meeting all of the downstream minimum flow requirements, and the ACF system conservation storage is also in Zone 1 and is forecasted to remain in Zone 1 for the next few weeks.
Thank you, Jody.
Thank you.
Now I'll turn it over to Samantha Lucas with Apalachicola Bay Salinity.
All right, thank you, Rachel, and hi, everyone. This month's update will be through October 12th, and if we have any new listeners, we focus in on 3 of our water quality stations throughout the Apalachicola Bay system. One is located in East Bay, which is the nursery area of the system, and then we have one at Cat and Dry Bar, which are on historic oyster bars. And the first one we're going to check out is our Cat Point data. And this time range will be from September 20th through October 12th. And if we go ahead and look at that data, you're going to notice that salinity is in the lower percentile ranges, and there is not much, there's not much deviation from that. There's no large increases or decreases during this time frame, and this is going to be typically the trend for the other 2 stations as well. We did get some periods of heavier rain, but one thing that's really going on is we're having higher river flow. Discharges increase and the river level is rather high. It has been pretty surprising when we've gone out to sites along the river. I've never seen it that high before. But we can go ahead and move on to our dry bar station now. All right, now, similar to Cat Point, we have really low salinity readings here as well, and this update is from September 14th through October 12th. The majority of the salinity ranges here fall in the lowest percentile range, and it even goes lower than it typically has in some instances. Now, this station is really influenced by the river because the river water runs west of the system, and Dry Bar is stationed on the westerly portion of the bay. And similar to Cat Point, there's not much deviation. It's all generally within that range. And I'll be interested to see what it does throughout the rest of the fall. And we can go ahead and move on to East Bay. All right, so East Bay decreased at the beginning of October and then rose a little bit, but again, we're still within those lower percentile range. It's currently within the 10th to 24th percentile range. I don't expect this to go much higher than it currently is. This one is also heavily influenced by the river, just due to its proximity. It's up really close, especially to the East River, where it's at. So again, I expect this trend to continue, but I have been surprised in the past. And we can go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. All right, so overall, all of our salinity values are rather low for all 3 stations. There's no large increases or decreases occurring. They're all within those lower percentile ranges. So this is pretty quick for this month, but I know that David Zierden did ask about red tide. You know, I cannot give you a current update as I have not been out on the water yet this week, but I was out last week. There were certain points along the bay that we were at that we did experience respiratory irritation, but it seems to be decreasing. I'll be interested to see FWC's most recent update. I'm expecting them to update their website at some point this week, but we'll actually be going out and doing nutrient collection. We do that every month. And we'll collect HAB samples to send to the FWC lab in St. Pete. So we'll be contributing to that, to those readings next week as well. So unfortunately, no current update for you, but I hope that's a little bit helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. And if you don't mind, if you have a link to that FWC page where they'd be updating the red tide information, I'm sure there'd be some people that would be interested in finding that. If you could put it in the chat for me.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely put that in the chat. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, there's a typo on this slide. We have Todd Hamill today with our streamflow forecast. Sorry about that, Todd.
That's okay. So with all of that being said, I'm going to try and address what we're looking at in the future for our stream flows and for our rivers and reservoirs. So to start off with, we'll talk about the top, and you can see that Lake Lanier, Beaufort. This is looking at the GEF S model for rainfall, and it's rainfall, and so how it will it affect our rivers and our inflows into the reservoirs over the next 10 days. You can see we do have some decent inflows based on the forecast over the next 10 days with about 7,000 CFS. And because, you know, just any kind of rainfall right now, as mentioned before, we have been relatively wet, so any type of rainfall that we get tends to be rather productive in producing runoff. And so right now that's kind of what we're seeing with some of these. So we do still see some inflows into Lake Lanier that will help keep that system recharged during this time of year. So we'll go through and we'll do each of these over the next 10 days. So we'll go to the next slide. This was Lake Lanier near Beaufort. So this is the Chattahoochee River. So this is below the reservoir. And so a lot of that's local inflows. And so you'll see that we do have just a few bumps as we get rainfall in the top of the basin, possibly over the next few days, and we'll see how that affects it. But really, we're not seeing flooding chances, but our antecedent conditions again are wet, so it doesn't put us into drought, but it does keep us at least keep the rivers moving and doesn't give them an opportunity to really get into a drought situation. So that's good news when we start talking about drought. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide, which will take us a little further downstream. And actually it doesn't. We go over to the Flint River near Lovejoy. So we'll go on over, and it has a similar to Whitesburg in that we do have we'll get a little bit of rainfall and a little bit of rise in there, but we're not looking at flooding, and we're still not looking at any drought in that area. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And so there's the Flint River at Albany. So we get down to the bottom of that basin. And again, we're not expecting, we really are kind of drying out over the next couple of weeks, as David mentioned. And so that's kind of keeping us from getting very wet during that time and having the chance for flooding. But we're also, because we've been wet enough, it does keep our stream flows higher. So it really, again, it doesn't look like any drought situations developing in the southeast. And let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. And so this is the Apalachicola River near Bluntstown, and it was mentioned before, they're putting out a lot of water from the dam there, and it's obviously causing salinity problems, as we heard just a little while ago. And because we've had so much water in the basin, and we keep pushing water downstream from the top of the basin through that and through Woodruff Reservoir, the Apalachicola River near Bluntstown has been fairly high for the last few months, but it is finally slowing down a little bit. Don't have quite as high of releases there, and so that's we're getting more back to normal for this time of year. And so we are seeing that, but you can see as much as was mentioned before about the salinity, and it is because we've had a lot of fresh water, as she mentions. We have had a lot of fresh water moving through that system, and that looks to at least continue through the next couple of weeks, but that is starting to dampen out now. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. So our Southeast RFC climatology, and we are in right around week 43. And you can see that that's kind of a lull. I usually have an arrow in there. It's missing now, but this is when we kind of go in between the, this is our flood climatology, and we're going from our tropical season, and November tends to be that early, that November timeframe, late October, early November tends to be a little quieter time, just because we're transitioning from the active tropical season to the starting to go into the winter recharge season. So we tend not to have as much flooding, and this is the time of year, unless we have a tropical event and things really do start to wind down, as David showed in the chart of the hurricane season, we really do start to wind down at this time. So climatologically, this is a quiet time of year until we start to get to our recharge period, which will really kind of start to spin up in early December. So, so again, we'll be watching that to see where we are, but this is following climatology, and that we're quiet right now, and that's good news. So we'll go ahead and go on to the next slide in our forecast for the next month. And because we have continued, because we are continuing to be wet up at especially at the top of the basin, we have had a lot of rain above Lake Lanier and in those areas. So we will likely stay above normal as we continue to get inflows into the reservoir and needing to release water through that system. It hasn't been quite as quiet up in the northern part of the state as maybe it has in parts of the central part of the state. But so we'll likely over the next month stay above normal, but the rest of the area has kind of had a little bit of a break over the last few weeks. And so just based on the forecast for the next week, where it looks below normal for the next week, and then even for the following week, some below normal in the Apalachicola Basin and the Flint River Basin, will be more near normal. And again, we'll be below normal rainfall, but because our rivers are still so high, and like I said, the antecedent conditions are high, we will probably stay in that normal range. As for the next slide, which is the 3-month outlook. And so as we start to look at that outlook, David mentioned as we go through the winter and how we're leaning towards a La Nina outlook and much dryness. One of the benefits of having a wet fall and going into that period is that it's likely that we'll at least stay normal during that time, and possibly could be a little bit above normal, because we've still got a lot of water to work with in the ground and in our streams, and that even some below normal rainfall will still likely keep us in at least normal, and maybe even a little bit above normal. The likelihood of below normal is not there. The biggest concern is what happens as we get to the end of that time period. Now we only go the 3 months here, and so that's really November, December, and January. The bigger concern is once we get out to the March timeframe. If we continue to stay dry and we don't get wet as we get out of March and into spring, that's when I think our big concerns for drought will start to show up. And so we'll have to watch this winter to see if we're lucky. Maybe it's a little more like last winter, where we had a little bit of normal, had enough rainfall. But we will see that. Like I said, but my bigger concern is not for the winter for going into drought, but more as we come out of winter and into the spring after this period. And again, we'll be able to talk about that as we go through the rest of this year. And let's go to my last slide. So no flooding expected in the next 10 days. Our stream flow forecast for the month, near normal, but above normal for the upper Chattahoochee, just a little bit. And then our 3-month stream flow forecast, near normal expected, even with a little bit of drier outlook because of the antecedent conditions. And then here's some information about where you can go to continue to see those updated forecasts. And that's it for me.
Thanks, Todd. Now I'd like to open up the floor for any questions, comments, and discussion you may have. You can raise your hand, unmute yourself, or use the question or chat box. Okay, I don't see any questions coming in, so I want to thank our speakers once again, David Zierden, Tom Littlepage, Pauline Korn, Jody Juan, Samantha Lucas, and Todd Hamill. Mark your calendars for our next webinar on Tuesday, November 23rd, same time, 1 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Central. There will be a video recording of this webinar posted to YouTube, as well as in a follow-up email you will receive from me within 24 to 36 hours. Thank you for being here today.